Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited to be covering the New Orleans Pelicans today with my official trade deadline predictions for New Orleans. If you're a Pelicans fan, first of all, I want to know how long have you been a fan of this organization for? Of course, some relocation, some movement, and the changing of the Hornets back over to Charlotte, all of that stuff. But just let me know, how long have you been cheering for a New Orleans-based NBA team? Comment that down right now in the comment section. I'll leave a heart on every single one of those comments. And if you guys do overall enjoy the video today and the information, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content so you don't miss out on future uploads. And let's jump into that video preview here. Now, we are going to have 3 predictions in today's video for the New Orleans Pelicans ahead of the 2025 NBA trade deadline. Now, these predictions can be quite wide-ranging. Some might have to do with the luxury tax or the salary cap apron. Some might have to do with which players get traded. What are some actual trade packages looking like? There's a wide variety of predictions in this video. I also have a question in this video which I want answered from you as well. We'll get to that later on. And then this is a real essential reminder. Starting on Monday, this upcoming week, I will be live on the channel, and I will be live for the entire week of the 2025 NBA trade deadline. So if you're looking for the best place to stay up to date on all of the news, all of the rumors, drama, everything that you want to see about the NBA trade deadline, who's getting traded where, what's the deal, what are my thoughts on those deals, this is the place to be. Really looking forward to having you guys again this year. Prediction number 1. The New Orleans Pelicans will dip below the luxury tax. At this point in time, when I'm recording this video, the Pelicans are currently $2.112 million above the luxury tax. And this is the most confident I am about any prediction at the trade deadline. Even more confident than Jimmy Butler getting traded. And that might sound crazy, but the New Orleans Pelicans have never spent in the luxury tax before. Never. And with that in mind, I think it's super safe to assume that the Pelicans, especially with how poor of a season that they've had, of course, health has determined a ton of that. The team has just not been healthy and they've not been very good either. This team is very much going to dip below the luxury tax. Now, there's a number of different ways that they could theoretically go about doing that. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in this video. But remember last year, my trade deadline prediction that was very firm last season for the New Orleans Pelicans was that they would trade Kira Lewis Jr. They ended up getting involved in the Toronto Raptors-Indiana Pacers trade that sent Pascal Siakam to Indiana before a run to the Eastern Conference Finals. Kira Lewis Jr. was the salary dumped player in there, and that was what I had predicted last year, was that Kira Lewis Jr. would get salary dumped. He was the super obvious choice last year based on how much money he made, and the Pelicans, I believe at the time, were about $4 to $5 million over the luxury tax. Kira Lewis made a little bit over $5 million, so it just made a ton of sense that they would salary dump him somewhere, get below the tax that way. This year, it's not quite as clear because of, first of all, they're super close to the actual tax itself, just $2.1 million over, which means there's a variety of different ways that they could get there. There's pretty much any kind of player on their roster they could trade in some form or combination to get below the tax if they wanted to. So let's talk about a player I do think will get traded, and that's prediction number 2 here. I do ultimately think the New Orleans Pelicans will trade Brandon Ingram, and I don't believe the value they get back for him is going to be extremely intriguing for Pelicans fans. Now, I'm not saying they're getting absolutely nothing in return for him, but for Brandon Ingram's talent level, the value in the package they receive might not quite match that former all-star capability we've seen Brandon Ingram live up to. Remember, he's got a $36 million expiring salary, and again, for the Pelicans looking to shave a little bit more than $2.1 million, this contract that Brandon Ingram has not only gives them the ability to get below the luxury tax, but it also gives them the ability to either take in a variety of different salaries. That way they could have bird rights on specific players if they're expiring salaries, or they could trade it for maybe a young player and a bad contract that they'd have to eat. There's a few different ways New Orleans could go about doing this, and here are some potential trade partners. The Detroit Pistons have been a potentially rumored Brandon Ingram team for a while now. I think from a front office perspective, the fact that Trajan Langdon is the president of basketball operations there in Detroit provides a real link, a real connection between Brandon Ingram and the Pelicans and Pistons organizations specifically being able to work together on a deal. Now, again, I'm not guaranteeing that the Pistons go out and get him, but there are some of those links there. They have $14+ million in cap space, so they don't even have to perfectly match money, which could be a very useful tool as well for New Orleans. I think the Pistons would have interest in another New Orleans Pelicans wing. We'll talk about him in just a minute, though. The Portland Trailblazers, another really fascinating destination for Brandon Ingram. In theory, this team who drafted Donovan Clingan has DeAndre Ayton's massive salary, and a trade between Brandon Ingram and DeAndre Ayton, while it wouldn't completely get the Pelicans below the tax, it would get them really darn close. So if there was another small move attached in this, or there's some other outgoing salary somewhere else where they shave off, a couple $100,000 here or there, the Pelicans could get below the tax while still getting a player in DeAndre Ayton who has high pedigree, former number 1 overall pick, has had some monster performances over the last few years, has also had some really bad, low effort, low quality performances in that mix as well. But I do think for New Orleans specifically, one of their concerns is they just don't want to lose Brandon Ingram for nothing into free agency. The Brooklyn Nets could maybe be seen as a potential suitor for him. We'll see how all of that materializes if Ingram does ultimately test free agency and try to sign elsewhere. But at this point in time, I think if New Orleans is looking to trade him, they could view Ayton as kind of a stopgap center for them while Yves Missi is still developing. I know Pelicans fans love Yves Missi, but I think Ayton would bring, another kind of big body, skilled big man into the mix for them that could fill some minutes between now and both this year and next season. And that's one of the allures of making this kind of trade with Portland is you get Ayton's contract not just for the rest of this year, but going into next season as well. When it comes to the Toronto Raptors, there's been a heavy dosage of reports that Toronto would be interested, and they do have a variety of different contracts to work with. This is where we could see a 3-team or 4-team trade maybe materializing. The Raptors have Bruce Brown's expiring contract. They have Chris Boucher, who's been playing pretty good this season. I think definitely has value around the league. You also look at Kelly Olynyk, another guy that they could potentially route somewhere. There's some noise about a variety of different players on the Toronto Raptors roster, including young wing Ochai Agbaji. Is there some type of trade to be had here where New Orleans works with Toronto, maybe something centered around Bruce Brown and Kelly Olynyk? The money gets them, again, relatively close to dipping below the tax. In fact, that number might put them directly below the tax by like $100,000. It would be really, really close. But I think the overall message here is that Brandon Ingram's going to be readily available to a lot of these teams. Utah, I could see Danny Ainge looking at this as a value grab. Now I know Jazz fans are going to say, well, Brandon Ingram won't want to extend in Utah. While that might be true, he might not want to extend in Utah. The only real competitor you might have in free agency is the Brooklyn Nets in terms of cap space teams. So Utah, it's a pretty area. It's a pretty region of the United States. And I don't think that Brandon Ingram, if he's getting offered a pretty good paycheck on the back end of it, would completely turn down that decision. You think about what Utah did to acquire John Collins. Again, another value addition that they made a few years ago. I could see them looking at Brandon Ingram in a similar light. And then the Miami Heat. I wanted to include them. Brandon Ingram's huge expiring salary could offer the Heat flexibility. Post Jimmy Butler, if Miami turns this into a 3-team, 4-team, 5-team trade for Jimmy Butler, which I expect them to ultimately do, Brandon Ingram to Miami is not the most ridiculous, outlandish thing because of his expiring contract. And Miami, if they do want to just flat out, move with flexibility going forward, Brandon Ingram's someone who could make a ton of sense for them as a return piece in a potential Jimmy Butler trade. Now moving on here to prediction number 3. And this one is regarding both Zion Williamson and Herb Jones. My final prediction here for the New Orleans Pelicans is that both of these two wings stay in New Orleans. Now, Zion Williamson saying to media that since he works for the New Orleans Pelicans, he will not be playing in back-to-backs because the team, the medical staff specifically, does not think it's good for him and good for his overall health and durability and long-term career to play in back-to-backs. Now, the way that Zion Williamson framed that to the media, talking about that he was okay with playing in back-to-backs, but the fact that the Pelicans do not want him to, first of all, it might be a sign to other teams, kind of a signal of saying, look, if you trade for me, I'm going to try and play, and I'm going to try and play in back-to-backs too. So he's trying to maybe remove any red flag around him right now about the health. Now, obviously, he's been so injured. Mocking up trades for Zion Williamson is just one of the most difficult things to do because you think back to who he was as a prospect, how dominant he was for the Duke Blue Devils. You look at his 2 All-Star appearances in the NBA, how utterly insane he can be as a rim finisher, a driver of the basketball, and an offensive superstar, honestly, at times. And then you also look at the downsides where he misses so many games. He's missed almost as many games as he played in his NBA career. really a difficult kind of discussion, because if you're the Pelicans, you're going to want good stuff for Zion Williamson. You spent the first overall pick on him. You drafted him over Ja Morant. He's been a multi-time All-Star. He was considered to be the next face of the franchise post Anthony Davis. The bummer here is none of those things materialized, but he's still in his early to mid-20s. So if you're New Orleans and you trade him away and all of a sudden he gets healthy and stays healthy, you look like an absolute fool. And that's why I think a trade here for Zion Williamson just does not materialize this trade deadline. Maybe in the offseason, maybe next year at the trade deadline, I could see something maybe coming to a fruition at that point in time. But this trade deadline, I just think it's a little too unlikely given all of the pressure and all the concern that would maybe be on David Griffin and the Pelicans front office, that if they trade him and don't get enough for him and then he ends up being healthy, it could look like one of the worst trades in the NBA over the last couple of years because of who Zion Williamson is and how talented of an actual basketball player he is when he's on the court. For Herb Jones, I said at the trade deadline best assets video that I recorded a couple days ago, Herb Jones is the Pelicans' most valuable player on the trade market. He is a guy with his contract. He's making pennies on the dollar compared to his actual impact and value around the league. This is the type of player pretty much every single contending team in the league would love to have, and every single rebuilding team would love to have. This is the type of player who can fit in multiple different lineups. He gives you lineup flexibility. Of course, at Alabama, played some small ball center and has had some success in small stretches doing that a little bit in the NBA. But then you think about him being able to guard point guards, guard two guards. He guards threes and fours. Like, the whole guards 1 through 5 thing is overblown for pretty much any player that's ever had that said about them before. Herb Jones is one of the few guys who really has that level of switchability and that experience to play in a little bit of drop coverage or hedge out on the perimeter switch. He does a little bit of everything, and I think you look at him as an overall team defender, his help impact, his help defensive impact, he is unbelievable. He's an elite on-ball defender. He's an elite off-ball defender. There's a reason he was NBA All-Defense first team last year as the only perimeter player to make it. You know, I think there's a real argument that Herb Jones is just flat out the best perimeter defender in the world. And for New Orleans to trade him, they're going to need to get 2+ first-round picks at the bare minimum. At the bare minimum, they need to get that. Of course, salary would have to be included. Ultimately, I don't think New Orleans trades him this year. Again, could be a discussion to be had either in the offseason or next year at the trade deadline, if a deal ultimately does not materialize for Herb Jones this season. Now, I do have a bonus question for you here, and I want to know what you guys think about what happens with C.J. McCollum. Will C.J. McCollum actually get traded this year? He has another year left on his deal with descending money, so he could become an expiring contract next year, making just a little bit over $30 million. Next year, he's making a little bit over $33 million this season. What happens with C.J. McCollum? Is there a real market for him? He's had some individual masterclass performances this season, 40+ bombs on a couple of occasions already. So I think McCollum could be a player that could help a contending team, although with the new CBA and the way that, you know, teams are kind of afraid of bigger salaries, even though McCollum's contract is shorter term with just 1 year after this year and descending value, I still think there would be some real caution and hesitancy for teams to make some kind of trade for McCollum, given his age, given some of the defensive stipulations and questions, obviously, that have centered around his career, even since he was in Portland. I think there's a lot of concerns or problems with trying to make a move for a CJ McCollum level player, even though he's really darn good, very talented. The teams that are interested in adding tools and skills probably already have, you know, a lead ball handler, a lead initiator. So that's where McCollum's fit becomes a little questionable. Now, I do think there's a few number of places he could look really good. Orlando would be one of them, which would be interesting. But all in all, with his salary and age and defensive limitations, I just don't really know what happens here. So I want you guys to comment down below. What happens with CJ McCollum? Do the Pelicans trade him? Do they just flat out keep him, try and use him as an expiring salary either in the offseason or at the trade deadline next year? As you can tell, we're kind of kicking the can down the road a bit here with some of the Pelicans things because I just don't really know what they're going to do. Like, this is exactly what they did with Brandon Ingram. They kicked the can down the road. Now they have an expiring contract and they might get, you know, 50 cents for the dollar that they're trying to trade away. So we'll see what happens. The Pelicans, one thing I can for sure guarantee you, they dip below the luxury tax. That is a no-brainer. I really hope you guys did enjoy the video. Thank you all so much for watching. Really, really appreciate you guys taking time out of your day. If you did enjoy, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content. And then don't forget, biggest reminder, We will be live on the channel the entire week of the NBA trade deadline. You guys need to be there. Don't be square. Make sure to stick around for that and keep your eyes open for the trade deadline live streams. And we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.